Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to my lecture. In this lecture today, I'm going to discuss about the classification of the proteins. If we look at the classification of proteins, there are different ways the proteins are classified. They can be classified on the basis of their biological function. They can be classified on the basis of their chemical nature, their composition, their shape, as well as their source from where these proteins are being derived. On the basis of their source, the source की basis पर proteins can be categorized as animal proteins and plant proteins. So these two classes of the proteins, these can be categorized as class 1 proteins for the animal proteins and class 2 proteins for the plant proteins. So let's look over here that these proteins are classified as class 1 proteins are those proteins that can be referred to as complete proteins. Actually, these are known as complete proteins because they containing all the required amino acids, all that of essential as well as non-essential amino acids are present in case of complete proteins. So these proteins basically referred to as the class 1 proteins. Examples of such proteins are the animal proteins. And for the incomplete proteins, which are categorized under the class 2 proteins, they basically named so because they actually lack some amino acids. Some amino acids are not present over here. Such proteins are categorized under the incomplete proteins. So all the plant proteins are known as the incomplete proteins or class 2 proteins. Similarly, the proteins can be monomeric as well as multimeric. Monomeric means only single unit, or multimeric means different, many units or many polypeptides are there. In case of monomeric protein, a protein is said to be monomeric if only one polypeptide chain is present or a single polypeptide chain is present, then this protein can be referred to as a monomeric protein. If you look at the example of such protein is the lysozyme that is present in the saliva, that is actually a bactericidal enzyme or protein, and myoglobin of the muscles also categorized as a monomeric protein. Similarly, multimeric proteins are those proteins which contain more than one polypeptide chains. For example, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin have two alpha chains and two beta chains. So these are you can say as multimeric proteins because they have more than one polypeptide chain. So in case of hemoglobin, it is having four polypeptide chains. So it is having four polypeptide chain. That's why it is categorized under the multimeric proteins. So normally the protein classification is based on their biological function, their composition, and their you can say their nature. Let's first look at the biological functions, protein classification on the basis of their biological functions. So in this classification is mainly based on the particular function that is carried out by the protein. So these can be catalytic proteins, structural proteins, contractile proteins, transport proteins, regulatory proteins, protective proteins, that can be also defense proteins, storage proteins, etc. So when we look at the catalytic proteins, so catalytic proteins now actually what is the meaning of the catalysis? So basically catalysis means that accelerating the rate of any chemical reaction. So these proteins which can help in accelerating a particular rate of other chemical reactions, they are classified as the catalytic proteins. They have their role in the catalysis, and we all know that the enzymes are basically the proteins which can help in the catalysis, right? So these enzymes are also known as the catalytic proteins. Examples of the enzymes, you can say that hexokinase, amylase, etc. All these enzymes, these are actually protein in nature, so they have role in the catalysis. So all such proteins can be categorized as the catalytic proteins which have a role in the catalysis. They have role in accelerating the particular chemical reactions. And next is the So next is the structural proteins. So structural proteins are those proteins which can help in the maintenance of the structure of various tissues. So here we have the two examples like collagen and elastin and keratin as well. So we can see that the structure of the hair and the nails is maintained by the keratin. So second is the collagen, which is important in the structure of the bone. So what is the role of the structural protein? So structural proteins basically provide cell particular shape. They have supportive role. They provide support to the bones, to the hair, and the cartilages. So their examples include collagen and elastin and keratin of the hair and the nails. And the next group is the contractile proteins. So these proteins basically help in the contraction and relaxation of the particular muscles. So here you can say that those proteins that have function in the contraction of the particular muscle fibers, they are categorized under the contractile proteins. Examples of such proteins are the actin and myosin of the muscles. So next is the transport proteins. Transport proteins are those proteins which basically help in the transport of various substances in our body. So these transport proteins basically help in the transport of various substances in our body. For example, we have hemoglobin, we have GLUT4 glucose transporters over there. So these have a role to transport certain materials within the cell or within the body. For example, hemoglobin, it can transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so these are categorized under the transport proteins. And next category is the regulatory proteins. So regulatory proteins, or you can say that these are the hormonal proteins. These are the proteins in our body which can act like a hormone. For example, insulin. If we look at insulin, अगर हम insulin को देखें तो insulin is a hormone which basically bring down the blood glucose level, right? So insulin is you can say it functions like a hormone, but chemically it is a protein. Similarly, growth hormone, it brings about the growth of the various tissues in our body. So it functions like hormone, but chemically it is a protein. So insulin and the growth hormones can be categorized under the regulatory proteins. So these can be categorized under the regulatory protein. Next are the protective proteins, or you can say defense proteins, which can help in the defense of our body system. For example, you know what is the defense system, immune system. So what happens actually when any foreign material, such as any foreign substance, that is bacteria or virus, when it is invades our body, at that time our body produces certain proteins. So these proteins are basically our defense proteins, or you can say these are the immunoglobulins, which are the antibodies. So these antibodies are categorized under the defense proteins or protective proteins. These immunoglobulins basically play a role. They help in killing of the foreign substances that are invading in our body, that invades our body, like viruses and bacteria. Okay, so the such proteins are categorized under the defense proteins. Similarly, we have storage proteins, etc. Now let's discuss the classification of the protein based on their composition. So on the basis of their composition, you can say on the basis of their chemical nature, the proteins can be categorized into three categories. These can be simple proteins. Next one is the second category is the conjugated proteins, and the third one is the derived proteins. Now now what I have said that under this system of classification, proteins are divided into three subgroups. These are the simple proteins, conjugated proteins, and derived proteins. So this classification is based on their chemical nature. Okay, so first let's have a look on the simple proteins. What are these simple proteins? As the name suggests, these simple proteins are really, they are very simple proteins. That's mean there is nothing anything else other than the proteins. So they are simply made up of only amino acid residues. So such proteins are known as simple proteins. क्योंकि इन proteins में सिर्फ amino acid residues होते हैं, there is no other residue other than the amino acids. So we can say that they are composed only of the amino acid residues, right? So these simple proteins are further subclassified on the basis of their shape. So these can be classified as globular proteins or fibrous proteins. So these globular proteins are basically the globules, or you can say these are the oval shaped proteins. ठीक है, जो spherical या oval shaped proteins होती हैं, these are the globular proteins. ठीक है, and if we go for their width and length, then they have normally equal width or length. And when the second subgroup over here is the fibrous protein. So these fibrous proteins, as the name suggests, that they are the fiber-like proteins. That means that their width is basically very small. They look like long fibers, ठीक है, long strands, long fibers, जिसमें इनकी जो width होगी वो बहुत कम होगी as compared to their length. So they just look like a fiber. That's why they are called as the fibrous proteins. और ये जो fibrous proteins हैं, इनको हम scleroproteins भी कहते हैं. They are also known as the scleroproteins, और फिर you can say there is another name for the scleroproteins is the albuminoids. ठीक है, so remember that these are not albumins, these are albuminoids. ठीक है, albuminoids are the other name for the scleroproteins. So let me write over here that scleroproteins are also known as the albuminoids. ठीक है, so these are not albumins. Albumins is something else. Albuminoids are basically the fibrous proteins, जिसको हम कह रहे हैं, these are the scleroproteins. Now the next category is the conjugated proteins. So as their name suggests, these are not they are not simple proteins. ठीक है, in case of simple proteins, we had seen that the simple proteins are composed of only amino acid residues, but here in this case conjugated proteins, amino acids are there. ठीक है, इसमें amino acids भी हैं, but in addition to amino acid there are certain non-protein parts, or you can say non-protein moieties are also present over here in case of conjugated proteins. ठीक है, so इस non-protein part को या non-protein moiety को हम क्या कहते हैं, that is known as the prosthetic group or conjugating group. So we can write that in addition to the amino acids, ठीक है, in addition to the amino acids, these proteins contain non-protein moiety. This non-protein moiety can be a prosthetic group or it can be a conjugating group. So if I want to show this in the simplified manner, I can write simple proteins plus non-protein group. That makes a conjugated proteins. ठीक है? So these conjugated proteins are in simplified manner. These can be simple proteins, क्योंकि simple proteins में सिर्फ amino acids present थे. Simple proteins and they have non-protein part. ठीक है, so these are classified as the conjugated proteins. So here there is one difference when we talk about the simple proteins. Simple proteins in this classification, simple proteins basically are independent. They have independent existence. इसका क्या मतलब है कि जो independent simple proteins हैं, they are basically functional. ठीक है, they are functional. ठीक है, so that means independently these proteins are functional, they can perform their functions. But here in conjugated proteins, the simple proteins, it is occurring as a part of conjugated protein. So they don't have separate identity. They don't have independent existence. ठीक है? That's why because these simple proteins, they are not independently functional. They become functional only when its non-protein part, its non-protein moiety, that can be prosthetic group or a conjugated protein, ठीक है, is attached with this simple protein. So that's why it is the conjugated protein. अब इसमें क्या डिफरेंस है सिंपल प्रोटीन और कॉन्जुगेटेड प्रोटीन में? सिंपल प्रोटीन में सिर्फ अमाइनो एसिड प्रेजेंट है और वो इंडिपेंडेंटली उनकी जो इंडिपेंडेंटली दे आर फंक्शनल. बट इन केस ऑफ कॉन्जुगेटेड प्रोटीन्स में जो सिंपल प्रोटीन्स है वो फंक्शनल नहीं है अनलेस जब तक उस पे नॉन प्रोटीन मोइटी अटैच ना हो जाए. नॉन प्रोटीन मोइटी मतलब कि प्रोस्थेटिक ग्रुप या फिर कॉन्जुगेटिंग ग्रुप अटैच ना हो जाए. जब ये दोनों चीजें अटैच होंगी तब ये प्रोटीन क्या करेगी, ये प्रोटीन फंक्शनल होगी. So, what happens कि these simple proteins have also given another name. इसमें जैसा कि मैंने आपको बताया कि conjugated proteins में basically we have simple proteins and we have non-protein proteins. So इसका जो protein part है, जो simple proteins है, इसको हम कहते हैं this is the apoprotein. और इसका जो non-protein moiety है, non-protein part को हम कहते हैं this is the conjugating group or the prosthetic group. And when these both moieties, these apoprotein and a conjugating or a prosthetic group, when they join, ठीक है, तो इससे that are going to make a hollow protein, जिसको हम कह रहे हैं कि इससे फिर एक complete functional protein basically बनती है. ठीक है. सो दे मेक अप द कॉन्जुगेटेड प्रोटीन्स, जिसमें आ जाता है कि हमारे पास सिंपल प्रोटीन एंड अ कॉन्जुगेटेड प्रोटीन्स. नेक्स्ट इज द third category is the derived proteins. So as their name suggests that these are the derived proteins, so they can be derived from simple proteins or as well as from conjugated proteins. ठीक है. So these are basically you can say ऐसी प्रोटीन्स जो कि सिंपल प्रोटीन से बनती हैं या फिर वो कॉन्जुगेटेड प्रोटीन से बनती है, तो उनको हम क्या कह रहे हैं, these are categorized as the derived proteins. Now the second thing is how they are derived. So ये मतलब किस तरह से ड्राइव होती हैं. So they are derived either by the denaturation or degradation. There are two ways to produce derived proteins or derived products from the simple and the conjugated proteins. These two processes can be denaturation or degradation. So these can be, you can say these can be denatured or degraded products of the simple and conjugated proteins. Okay. So right now here we have to differentiate between these two words, what is denatured or what is degraded. So when we look at the denaturation, ठीक है, तो इसमें denatured proteins हम उन proteins को कहते हैं जिसमें means you can say that all the weak interactions of the proteins are broken down. ठीक है. weak interactions protein के कौन से होते हैं? We have hydrogen bonds, van der Waals forces और hydrophobic interactions. लेकिन जो स्ट्रॉन्ग इंटरेक्शंस होते हैं दे आर नॉट गोइंग टू ब्रोकन डाउन इन केस ऑफ डीनेचरेशन. ठीक है. डीनेचरेशन में सिर्फ जो वीक इंटरेक्शंस होंगे वो ब्रोक होंगे और जो स्ट्रॉन्ग इंटरेक्शंस है लाइक पेप्टाइड लिंकेजेस दे आर नॉट गोइंग टू ब्रोकन डाउन. बट इन केस ऑफ degraded, so degraded means complete hydrolysis of peptide linkage or a peptide bond is there. ठीक है. You can say that in case of denaturation there is no any shortening of the polypeptide chain, whereas in the degradation of the proteins there is the shortening of the polypeptide chain. So what I have said that there are two things. One is the uh, denature denature denatured products or denatured proteins. So denatured proteins are those in which only the weak interactions are going to broke. ठीक है. Not only not these strong interactions. So that can be hydrogen bonding. Let me write for example. These are the hydrogen bonding. These are the hydrogen bonds, van der Waals forces, and then all such forces are going to broken in case of denatured protein. And next we have degraded proteins. Degraded proteins में there is जो there is hydrolysis of the peptide linkage is there. So these are, you can say that these derived proteins are the denatured or degraded products of the simple or conjugated proteins. So these denatured products are can be classified as primary derived proteins, and degraded products can be classified as the secondary derived proteins. ठीक है, you can say that these derived proteins can be further classified into denatured derived proteins, या फिर primary derived proteins और secondary derived proteins. ठीक हो गया. Now let's have a look on the examples of the simple proteins. So these are the simple proteins. As I have already told you, they can be classified on the basis of the shape. So these are the can be globular or fibrous proteins. So globular proteins may albumin is the most abundant example. That is the most abundant protein is present in the plasma. Okay, so this is spherical or oval shaped proteins. It is categorized under globular proteins. Similarly, we have the globulins that have important role in the liver function. ठीक है, and blood clotting, and they also have a role in their fighting infections. जैसा कि मैंने आपको बताया था, जो कि डिफेंस प्रोटीन्स होती हैं, they are also globulins, जिनको हम कहते हैं immunoglobulins. Similarly, other superfamily of the globular protein is the globins. ठीक है, that is the superfamily of the heme containing globular proteins. ठीक है, ऐसे proteins जिसमें heme होता है, for example hemoglobin is also categorized under the globular proteins. Similarly, we have histone proteins that provide the structural support for the chromosomes. ठीक है, histone proteins, you know, जो DNA जो न्यूक्लियोसोम के स्ट्रक्चर में बेसिकली प्रोटीन्स होती हैं, that are the histone proteins. And next are the fibrous proteins. If we go for the examples of the fibrous proteins, then these can be collagens and elastins. So collagens are the structural proteins in the various connective tissues. Similarly, we have elastins that provide stretchy characteristics. For example, your arteries, they are stretchable. Okay, so these stretchy characteristics in your arteries, these are because of the elastins. And similarly, जो keratins हैं, they provide the supportive role in the hair or structural support to the hair, nails. ठीक है, so these are categorized under the fibrous proteins or scleroproteins, या फिर जिसको हम क्या कहते हैं, these are the albuminoids. So next are the conjugated proteins. Conjugated proteins ki again we have different, you can say, subgroups or subclasses. ठीक है, conjugated proteins are made up of these simple proteins plus some non-protein part, जिसको हम कहते हैं prosthetic group or a conjugating group. So when these are the nucleoproteins, when the proteins and the nucleic acids are joined, they are they going to form nucleoproteins. Similarly, glycoproteins are the combination of the proteins and carbohydrates. इनको हम mucoproteins भी कहते हैं. And again we have lipoproteins. Lipoproteins में we have proteins and the lipids. So basically these are suggesting from their name, as lipoprotein name suggests that these are the combination of the proteins and lipids. Similarly, phosphoproteins are the combination of the proteins and phosphate groups. And similarly, chromoproteins over here, they are the combination of the proteins as well as the colored pigments. Similarly, the combination of the metal ions and the proteins are the metalloproteins. So these are the some examples of the conjugated proteins. Similarly, the derived proteins are the degraded or denatured products of the simple or the conjugated proteins. So here the examples can be peptones, peptides, polypeptides. ठीक है, all these examples comes under the you can say derived proteins. Okay, so these basically actually are the changes in the structure of the proteins from liquid to the solid state by some mechanical action कि जब हम इनको acids के साथ treat करेंगे या heat के साथ treat करेंगे then there will be either denaturation or degradation. So this is all about the protein classification that we discussed today. So, what I hope all the aspects of the classification of the proteins are now clear. So, if you have any question or confusion, then please write it down in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe my channel. Thank you very much, and best wishes.